The sun, a merciless copper coin in a bleached blue sky, beat down on the burgeoning city of Denver. It was a place of frantic ambition, where the mud of the frontier was being hastily paved over with the flagstones of civilization. Inside the cool marble halls of the Denver First National Bank, the city's cacophony was reduced to a reverent hum. Sunlight filtered through tall arched windows fell in golden shafts across the polished mahogany counters and the solemn faces of men discussing fortunes in hushed tones. Sarah Carpenter stood before one such counter, her gloved fingers clutching a small, velvet-lined box. At 26, she possessed an education that was a rarity for a woman in the Colorado Territory, and a quiet determination that was a direct inheritance from her father. Today, however, her composure felt as fragile as spun glass. Inside the box lay a silver locket oval, and unadorned its surface worn smooth by the touch of 2 generations of Carpenter women. It was the last tangible piece of her mother she had left. A safe deposit box. Miss Carpenter, the bank manager, a portly man named Mr. Abernathy, with a meticulously waxed mustache, inquired politely. A wise choice. Security is the bedrock of progress. Yes, thank you, Sarah replied, her voice softer than she intended. It was my mother's. I can't bear the thought of it being lost. Mr. Abernathy nodded with practiced sympathy. Of course. If you'll just follow me to the vault. The walk to the rear of the bank felt like a funereal procession. The great circular door of the vault stood open, a formidable gateway to the city's accumulated wealth. As Mr. Abernathy selected a key from a ring on his belt, the front doors of the bank burst open with a crash that shattered the building's cathedral-like peace. 3 men strode in, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, their long dusters failing to conceal the rifles they held with grim familiarity. Panic erupted. A woman screamed. Men in expensive suits dove for cover behind potted ferns and overturned chairs. The leader, a tall man with eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky, fired a single shot into the ornate ceiling. Plaster rained down, and the ensuing silence was absolute. "This is a robbery," he announced, his voice a low growl that carried an unnerving authority. "No one makes a sound, no one plays the hero, and everyone gets to see the sun set tonight." His gaze swept the room and settled on the vault. He gestured with his rifle. "You, manager, let's not waste time." Mr. Abernathy, pale and trembling, was prodded toward the vault. Sarah found herself frozen, caught between the robbers and the safety of the massive steel door. She pressed herself against the cool marble wall, making herself as small as possible, the velvet box clutched to her chest like a shield. The leader followed the manager into the vault, his 2 accomplices standing guard over the terrified customers. His name, though she did not know it then, was John Hawkins. He was not a common thief. He was an instrument of purpose, a weapon honed by war and wielded by a will far greater than his own. Inside the vault, his instructions were chillingly specific. He ignored the stacks of currency and bags of coin. "Box 714, he demanded, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Senator Carpenter's." Mr. Abernathy fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit one into the lock. I can't. It requires the owner's key as well." Hawkins's patience, a notoriously finite resource, evaporated. "The bank has a master key for emergencies." "This is an emergency. It's against every regulation," the manager protested weakly. Hawkins sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. He raised his rifle, the movement economical and without malice. It was simply the next logical step. The gunshot was deafeningly loud inside the vault. Mr. Abernathy crumpled to the floor, the argument of regulations settled permanently. Hawkins found the master key himself, and with a crowbar procured from a sack, began to work on the lock of box 714. The brutal sounds of metal striking metal echoed out into the bank, each impact a hammer blow against the silent terror of the hostages. It was in that moment of violent focus that a new figure appeared at the bank's entrance. Senator William Carpenter, his face etched with concern, had been delayed at a meeting and had come looking for his daughter. He took in the scene, the men with rifles, the terrified faces on the floor, and his gaze locked on the open vault door. "Sarah," he called out, his voice a mixture of command and fear. The sound of her father's voice broke Sarah's paralysis. "Father, no, get out." One of the guards turned his rifle on the senator. "Get on the floor, old man." But the senator ignored him, his eyes fixed on the vault. It was a fatal miscalculation, born of a father's love. Just as Hawkins finished prying open the security box, he heard the commotion. He emerged from the vault, a leather-bound journal in his hand, and saw the defiant old man standing by the door. Recognition was immediate. "Senator Hawkins," said with a tone of mock respect. "An unexpected pleasure." Without another word, he raised his rifle and fired. Senator Carpenter jerked backward, a crimson stain blossoming on his crisp white shirt. He collapsed his eyes, finding his daughter's one last time, his lips forming a single, silent word. "Run." Chaos became madness. Hawkins, seeing Sarah pressed against the wall, strode toward her. His eyes fell on the velvet box she clutched. "What's this?" More of the old man's secrets. Before she could react, he snatched the box from her hands. It fell open, revealing the simple silver locket. He picked it up, letting it dangle from its chain. "Pretty," he mused, a cruel smile touching his lips. He saw the anguish in her eyes and understood. This was personal. A trophy. He pocketed the locket, then grabbed her arm. "You're coming with me." A sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline gave Sarah strength. She twisted away, kicking backward at his shin. The unexpected move bought her a precious second. As Hawkins cursed and staggered, she fled. Not toward the front door, but toward a side office whose door had been left ajar. She burst through it, slammed it shut, and fumbled with the lock. A bullet splintered the wood inches from her head. She didn't wait for a second. A window looked out onto a narrow alley. Without hesitation, she shattered the glass with a heavy inkwell and scrambled through, heedless of the shards that tore at her dress and skin. She landed in the alley, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Behind her, she heard Hawkins shouting orders. She ran, her only thought to put distance between herself and the man who had just murdered her father and stolen the last piece of her mother. She clutched at her side where a sharp pain was blooming. A piece of flying glass, she thought, or perhaps something worse. There was no time to check. She had to keep running. She had to get away. She had to get her father's journal back. But as she fled deeper into the labyrinth of Denver's back alleys, the world began to tilt and blur, the edges of her vision darkening as the pain in her side resolved into the sickening warmth of blood. 50 miles away, where the mountains clawed at the sky and civilization was little more than a rumor, Elijah Morgan stood on the porch of his isolated ranch. At 45, his face was a testament to a life lived under an unforgiving sun and a heavier weight of sorrow. He watched a storm gather over the distant peaks, the bruised purple of the clouds mirroring the turmoil that was his constant companion. The ranch was his sanctuary, a fortress against memory. A sturdy cabin, a barn, a corral, each timber had been shaped and set by his own hands, a physical manifestation of his desire to build a life far from the world of men and their wars. He had come here, after his own war, after Gettysburg, seeking a quiet place to bury his ghosts. But ghosts were stubborn things. They did not respect fences. He went inside as the first drops of rain began to fall, the wind carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin's interior was sparse but orderly. A rack of well-maintained rifles and shotguns hung on one wall. A shelf of books, Shakespeare, Plutarch, military histories, stood testament to long, solitary winters. No photographs adorned the mantel. Memory served well enough to conjure the faces of his wife and son taken by fever while he was away fighting for a cause that had, in the end, cost him everything. Lightning flashed, illuminating a small wooden box on the mantel. He ran a hand over it, the wood smooth beneath his calloused fingers. Inside lay the Medal of Honor, awarded for his part in the charge at Cemetery Ridge. And beside it, a tarnished cavalry insignia. He never looked at them. They weren't trophies of heroism. They were markers on the path that had led him to this quiet damnation. Tonight, the ghosts were particularly restless. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the firelight. The routine was always the same. 1 drink to dull the edges, but never a second for fear of what the alcohol might dredge up from the depths. Nightmares were a regular feature of his sleep, but the whiskey dreams were worse. They were not of battle, but of a burning homestead, of the smell of pine and smoke, of a woman's scream, and the sight of a small hand-carved wooden bird lying in the dirt. A child's toy. He shook his head, trying to banish the image. It was a memory from the pacification campaigns after the war, a time when he had still been Captain Morgan Sherman Wade's most trusted officer, a time before the lines between duty and atrocity had blurred into nothing. He was halfway through his drink when a sound distinct from the drumming rain reached him. A horse moving at a desperate, stumbling gallop coming up the trail to his ranch. He set down his glass, his body tensing with an instinct honed on a dozen battlefields. Trouble didn't often find its way to his valley, but when it did, it usually arrived on horseback. He grabbed the Winchester from the wall rack and moved to the window, peering out into the maelstrom. The horse, a fine-looking bay, was riderless. It came to a halt in his yard sides, heaving 1 leg slick with blood. Eli's eyes followed the animal's back trail. There, not 30 yards from his cabin, lay a figure, a small, dark shape against the muddy ground. Cursing under his breath, he pulled on his coat and hat, lit a lantern, and stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at him, threatening to extinguish the lantern's flame. He reached the fallen figure and knelt, holding the light close. It was a woman, her golden hair matted with blood and mud, her face as pale as death. Her dress was torn and a dark stain was spreading across the fabric at her side. As he carefully turned her over, something fell from a concealed pocket in her coat. It was a leather-bound journal, its cover soaked, but its contents seemingly protected. He tucked it inside his own coat, his mind racing. Who was she, and what trouble had followed her here? He gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile. As he lifted her, her eyes fluttered open. They were a startling blue, clouded with pain and disorientation. Safe. She whispered the word, a faint puff of air. The journal. Must be. Her eyes closed again, and her head lolled against his shoulder. Eli carried her through the downpour to the cabin, kicked the door shut behind him, and laid her gently on his bed. He stoked the fire, adding logs, until the flames roared, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He worked quickly, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of her dress. The wound was on her right side, just above the hip, a deep gash, ragged and dirty. Not a bullet, he thought, but from glass or a fall. As he cleaned it, he found a smaller, cruder wound on her shoulder, a graze almost certainly from a bullet. She had been through a hell of a fight. As he was bandaging her side, a folded newspaper clipping, damp and smeared, fell from another of her pockets. He picked it up and held it to the light. The headline was stark: Senator Carpenter assassinated in Denver. Eli's blood ran cold. He looked from the newspaper to the unconscious woman's face. The resemblance was unmistakable. The strong jaw, the determined set of her mouth, even in unconsciousness. This was Sarah Carpenter, the senator's daughter. And if she was here wounded and on the run, then the trouble that had followed her was of the deadliest kind. The journal he had tucked inside his coat suddenly felt 10 times heavier. Senator Carpenter had been a crusader, a man determined to expose the rampant corruption that was poisoning the territory's growth. His primary target was the Transcontinental Railroad and its charismatic, ruthless chairman, Colonel Sherman Wade. The name hit Eli like a physical blow. Sherman Wade, his former commander, the man who had dragged him bleeding and half dead from a blood-soaked wheat field at Gettysburg, the man to whom he owed his life. A horse whinnied nervously from the barn. Eli moved to the window, peering out. He saw nothing but the curtain of rain, but the feeling of being watched was a palpable thing, a prickling on his skin that had nothing to do with the cold. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that they were not alone. He returned to Sarah's side. She was murmuring in a feverish delirium. "Father, the evidence. Wade knows." He gently retrieved the journal from his coat and opened it. The pages were filled with dense coded script, a jumble of letters and numbers that meant nothing to him. But its importance was now terrifyingly clear. This was the evidence Senator Carpenter had died for. And now it was here in his cabin, along with the senator's wounded daughter. The debt he owed Sherman Wade had been a weight on his soul for 11 years. A debt he had thought would never be called in. Now, as the storm raged outside and unseen eyes watched from the darkness, he understood that the bill had finally come due. And the price of payment would be the life of the woman lying on his bed. He checked the action on his Winchester, moved a chair to the window where he could watch the yard, and prepared to stand his ground. He had built this place to escape the world, but the world had just kicked down his door. The storm passed with the night, leaving a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. Dawn broke over a landscape of glistening pines and steaming earth. Inside the cabin, Sarah Carpenter drifted in a fever dream, her skin hot to the touch. The gash in her side was inflamed, the angry red streaks of infection beginning to spiderweb across her pale skin. Eli had done what he could, applying a poultice of herbs learned from a Ute healer years ago. But he knew it was a poor substitute for a doctor's care. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The ground told the story he already knew. Boot prints, at least 2 sets circling the cabin from a distance, studying it, waiting. They had been out there all night. Why hadn't they attacked? It was a question that troubled him more than an open assault would have. It suggested a confidence, a certainty that he was trapped. He returned inside to find Sarah awake, her blue eyes lucid despite the fever. She tried to sit up, a sharp gasp of pain escaping her lips. "Easy now," he said, moving to her side, offering a cup of water. "You've been through a lot." She drank gratefully, her eyes never leaving his face. "You? I know you," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "The photograph. In my father's study. You and Colonel Wade at Gettysburg. The heroes." The last word was tinged with a bitterness that scraped at Eli's conscience. "That was a long time ago," he said, turning away to stoke the fire. "My father trusted you," she pressed on. "He said you were the only decent man in Wade's command. He said if anything ever happened, if I was ever in trouble." She trailed off, a fit of coughing shaking her frame. Eli's back was to her, but he felt the weight of her words. William Carpenter had been the circuit judge who had found him in a jail cell years ago, lost in a drunken haze of grief and rage after his family's death. Instead of a prison sentence, the senator had given him a second chance, helping him secure the deed to this very land. "Build a life, Captain Morgan," he'd said. "Not just an existence." "Your father was investigating Wade," Eli stated, turning back to face her. She nodded her hand, moving protectively to her side. "The journal. It's all in there. Everything. Forged deeds, bribes, the sham treaties with the Ute. Wade is building an empire on stolen land and broken lives. My father was going to present it to the governor, and Wade found out." Tears welled in her eyes. "He sent a man with a scar on his face. I saw him shoot my father." Her voice broke. "He took my mother's locket." The detail was a small, sharp blade twisting in Eli's gut. This wasn't just business. It was personal cruelty. "We need to get that journal to Denver," she said, her resolve hardening through the grief. "You're in no condition to travel," he countered. "That wound is turning bad. And they're out there waiting. Then they will find us here. They'll have to come through me first." Eli said the words, surprising him with their vehemence. He hadn't chosen a side in any conflict since he'd left the army. He'd built his life on a foundation of neutrality. But looking at Sarah, at the legacy of decency her father represented, he felt the foundations shift. "Why?" she asked, her gaze penetrating. "Why would you help me? Everyone knows you owe Wade your life." The question hung in the air, demanding an answer he had never truly given himself. "I owe Wade for pulling me from that field," he said slowly. "But I owe your father for pulling me out of a different kind of hell. Some debts are paid in blood, others are paid in principle." He looked out the window. "We can't stay here. My monthly supply run to Silver Creek is due. No one would question me riding in. I can send a telegram from there." "I'm coming with you," she insisted. Before he could argue, a rider emerged from the tree line. He wore a long duster and a wide-brimmed hat, and he approached the cabin with the slow, deliberate confidence of a wolf circling its prey. He stopped 30 yards from the porch. "Morgan," the man called out. "I know you're in there, and I know who you're hiding." Eli moved to the door, his Winchester held ready but out of sight. "State your business." The rider pushed back his hat, revealing a face marked by a jagged scar that ran from temple to jaw. It was John Hawkins. "Just a friendly visit," Captain Hawkins said with a cold smile. "Colonel Wade sends his regards. He'd like his property back. The journal and the girl." From the bed, Sarah let out a small choked gasp. "That's him. Wade knows you owe him." Morgan Hawkins continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "He's calling in the debt. Don't make this difficult. Give them up and you can go back to your quiet life." "The woman is injured," Eli called back, stalling for time. "She needs a doctor. The colonel will see she gets the best care money can buy. Right before she hangs for treason." Hawkins's mocking laughter was a grating sound in the clean mountain air. He reached into his coat and produced something that glinted in the morning sun. A silver locket. He let it dangle from his fingers for a moment before dropping it into the mud. A calculated insult. A demonstration of power. "You have until noon," Morgan Hawkins declared. "Then my men and I are coming in, and we won't be as polite." He turned his horse and rode back toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows. Eli closed the door, his mind racing. Noon. Less than 3 hours. "We have to run," Sarah said, already trying to push herself off the bed. "We can't outrun them, not with you in this condition," Eli said grimly. He looked around the cabin at the sturdy log walls and the stone fireplace. The sanctuary he had built. He had never intended to fight for it, only to live in it. But now it was the only fortress they had. "Then we fight," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. The decision was made. The debt to William Carpenter would be paid today. The debt to Sherman Wade would be declared null and void. He began to work with a grim efficiency that was second nature. Barricading the windows, checking his ammunition, laying out his weapons. He moved with the fluid economy of a soldier preparing for battle. Sarah watched him, a mixture of fear and awe in her eyes. This was the man her father had spoken of. Not the haunted recluse, but Captain Morgan Wade's hammer, a man who knew the grim calculus of violence. "What can I do?" she asked. He handed her a revolver. "Do you know how to use this?" She nodded her hand, surprisingly steady as she took the weapon. "My father insisted I learn." "Good," Eli said. "Stay away from the windows. Don't fire unless they get inside. And whatever happens, protect the journal." He moved back to his post by the window, the Winchester feeling like a natural extension of his arm. He could see them now, fanning out in the trees, a dozen men taking up positions surrounding the cabin. The siege had begun. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed was about to be consumed by fire and blood. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had run from his past for 11 years, but his past had finally caught up. And he found to his own surprise that he was done running. The sun climbed toward its zenith, its light sharp and unforgiving. The silence outside the cabin was more menacing than any threat. Eli watched the tree line, his eyes tracking the subtle movements that betrayed the positions of Hawkins's men. They were professionals taking their time, applying pressure through presence alone. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Sarah sat on the floor, her back against the far wall, the revolver in her lap, and her father's journal tucked safely inside her coat. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, but her eyes held a spark of defiance. "They're trying to wear us down," Eli said, not taking his eyes from the window. "Make us make a mistake." "What was your greatest mistake?" Captain Sarah asked unexpectedly, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. The question caught him off guard. He thought of the war, of the men he'd lost, of his wife and son. But he knew that wasn't what she was asking about. She was asking about Wade. "Believing a good man couldn't become a monster," he said finally. "And believing a monster couldn't have once been a good man. The world isn't that simple." He glanced back at her. Wade. He had a vision. After the war, he saw a nation that could be connected, made strong. He believed in it. But somewhere along the way, the vision became more important than the people it was meant to serve. A rifle shot cracked from the trees, splintering the window frame next to Eli's head. He didn't flinch. The first move had been made. "They're getting impatient," he murmured. He raised his Winchester and fired a single, carefully aimed shot at a flicker of movement behind a pine tree. A cry of pain answered him. The response was a full-scale volley. Bullets hammered the log walls of the cabin, thudding into the wood like angry fists. Glass shattered. Splinters flew through the air. Eli and Sarah pressed themselves to the floor as the assault raged. When it subsided, Eli cautiously peered over the windowsill. 2 men were making a run for the barn, using the structure for cover to get a better angle on the cabin's less protected side. He fired twice his shots, kicking up dirt at their heels, forcing them to dive behind a water trough. "They're trying to flank us," he said. "If they get into the barn, they can pin us down." He moved to the back window, which looked out toward the barn. As he did, he saw more men moving up on the opposite side of the cabin, using the distraction to their advantage. They were caught in a classic pincer movement. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm and steady. "The fireplace. The back is loose stone. I built it so it could be cleared in case of a chimney fire. Start working on it. See if you can make an opening big enough to crawl through." While she began to pry at the stones with a fire poker, Eli moved between the windows, firing sparingly, but effectively keeping the attackers at bay. He was 1 man against a dozen, but he was 1 man on his own ground, in a fortress of his own making. For a time, it was enough, but they were relentless. A flaming arrow arced through the sky and thudded into the cabin's roof. Then another. The dry shingles caught quickly. Smoke began to seep through the ceiling. "How's it coming?" he shouted over the growing crackle of the fire. "Almost," Sarah called back, her voice strained. She had managed to dislodge several large stones, creating a small dark opening at the base of the chimney. Outside, Hawkins's voice boomed. "It's over, Morgan. You can burn or you can come out." Eli fired 1 last shot toward Hawkins' position, then moved to the fireplace. The smoke was getting thick, stinging his eyes and catching in his throat. "Go," he urged Sarah, pushing her toward the opening. "The woods are just beyond. Follow the creek downstream. It'll lead you toward Silver Creek." "What about you?" she cried, her face smudged with soot. "I'll hold them off. Buy you time." He pressed the revolver back into her hand. "Now go your father's work. It can't die here." She hesitated for only a second, her blue eyes meeting his in the flickering, smoke-filled light. An unspoken promise passed between them. Then she squeezed through the opening and was gone. Eli took a deep breath, coughed, and turned back to face the front of the cabin. The roof was now fully ablaze. The door was beginning to splinter under the blows of an improvised battering ram. He picked up his Winchester. He had bought her a few minutes. Now he just had to buy her a few more. The door crashed inward. Hawkins and 3 of his men stormed in, their faces grim in the firelight. Eli fired from a crouch, his shot taking the first man through the door. He worked the lever action, firing again, dropping a second man. But the other 2 were already fanning out, their pistols barking. A bullet seared across Eli's ribs. Another slammed into his shoulder, spinning him around. He fell, the Winchester clattering from his grasp. Hawkins stood over him, a triumphant sneer on his scarred face. "You should have taken the deal, Morgan." He kicked the rifle away from Eli's reach. "Where is she?" Eli just glared at him, gasping for breath through the pain and smoke. "Doesn't matter," Hawkins said, raising his pistol. "She won't get far." Before he could fire, a section of the burning roof collapsed inward with a roar, sending a shower of embers and flaming timbers down between them. Hawkins and his men scrambled back toward the doorway to escape the inferno. In that moment of chaos, Eli, driven by an instinct for survival, he thought he had long since buried, rolled through the searing embers, grabbed a burning piece of timber, and lunged. He brought the makeshift club down on the back of the last man in line, then staggered out of the cabin and into the yard, collapsing to his knees. His home, his sanctuary, was a roaring funeral pyre behind him. Hawkins and his remaining man emerged, beating out sparks on their dusters. "Get him," Hawkins snarled. But as they advanced, a new sound cut through the air, the thunder of approaching hooves. A dozen riders crested the nearby ridge, their rifles glinting in the sun. They were not Hawkins's men. They were Ute warriors, their faces painted for battle, led by a tall, grim-faced man Eli recognized as Grey Wolf. Hawkins and his man froze, caught between the burning cabin and the unexpected arrivals. For a moment, no one moved. Then Grey Wolf raised his hand and gave a sharp cry. The warriors charged. Hawkins and his man didn't stand a chance. They were overwhelmed in a flurry of disciplined violence. Eli watched, slumped against the corral fence, as the battle he had started was finished by others. When it was over, Grey Wolf approached him. "The woman," the warrior said in accented English. "She came to us," said the ghost soldier, fought for her. Ghost soldier, the name the Ute had given him years ago after he had defied his own commander to prevent a massacre. "Is she safe?" Eli managed to ask. Grey Wolf nodded. "She is with our healers. But she said you would need help." He looked at the burning cabin. She was right. He offered Eli a water skin. "Wade's men have been poisoning our lands, breaking treaties. Your fight is our fight now." Eli drank the cool water, a balm on his parched throat. He had lost his home, his solitude. He was wounded and exhausted. But as he looked at the Ute warriors, he realized he was no longer alone. He had chosen a side, and in doing so had found allies he never expected. He had bought Sarah time, and that time had been enough. The journey was a feverish haze. Eli rode slumped in his saddle, supported by a Ute warrior, his wounds crudely but effectively bound. They traveled through rugged, hidden trails known only to the tribe, putting miles between them and the smoldering ruins of Eli's ranch. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams a chaotic mix of the firefight and older, darker memories, the burning homestead from his past, Sherman Wade's commanding voice, the weight of a child's life on his conscience. They reached the Ute village, a hidden sanctuary nestled in a high mountain valley, as dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Sarah rushed to meet them, her face a mask of worry. She had been treated by the tribe's healer, an old woman named Wildflower, and though still weak, the infection in her own wound had been checked. "Eli," she breathed, helping the warriors ease him from his horse. The use of his given name was a quiet intimacy that cut through his pain. "The journal," he rasped. "Safe," she assured him. "Everything is safe." He was taken to a lodge where Wildflower worked on his wounds, her gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle as she cleaned and stitched his flesh. The pain was immense, but it was a clean pain, a physical agony that was almost a relief from the deeper wounds of his soul. Later, Sarah sat with him, feeding him a thin, nourishing broth. In the quiet of the lodge, lit by a single small fire, the barriers between them began to fall away. "My father's journal," she began, her voice low. "It's coded, but I've been working on deciphering the most recent entries. He wrote about a massacre, years ago. A settlement of homesteaders who had made a private peace with the Ute. They were wiped out in a punitive military action, a case of mistaken identity." Eli's blood ran cold. He knew the incident she spoke of. He had been there. He believed she continued unaware of the turmoil she was causing, that one of the officers involved was Sherman Wade, and that Wade has been covering it up ever since. The homesteaders were on land that the railroad now claims. My father thought Wade used the raid as an excuse to clear the land. Eli closed his eyes, the past rising up to choke him. He could see it all so clearly, the confusion, the conflicting orders, Captain Morgan trying to stop the slaughter, but being too late. "There's more," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "According to my father's source, Wade wasn't the only one there with a secret. The Homesteader family. Their name was Coulter. Mary and Thomas Coulter and their young daughter Emily. They weren't on any official manifest. They were squatters living off the grid." She looked at him, her eyes wide with the horror of the story. My father believed Wade's own family had been killed there. The pieces crashed together in Eli's mind with the force of a physical blow. The story he'd always heard was that Wade's wife and daughter died of fever back east while he was at war. A lie. A carefully constructed lie to hide a truth far more terrible. Wade hadn't been covering up a land grab. He'd been covering up the graves of his own family. "Eli, are you all right?" Sarah asked, her hand resting on his forehead. He opened his eyes. The fever he felt had nothing to do with his wounds. "Sarah," he said, his voice raw. "The raid. I was there. I was Captain Morgan. I followed Wade's orders." The color drained from her face. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "I tried to stop it," he said desperately, the confession pouring out of him after years of silence. "When I realized the intelligence was wrong, that they were civilians, I tried. But it was too late. Wade. He lost his mind. I saw him standing over the bodies of a woman and a little girl. I didn't know they were his. I thought he was just consumed by the madness of it all. Afterward, he covered it up. He told me if the truth ever came out, we would both hang for war crimes. He saved my life at Gettysburg, and then he chained me to his silence." The silence in the lodge was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Sarah stared at him, her expression a mixture of shock, horror, and a dawning terrible understanding. "This isn't about land or money, is it?" she whispered. "For Wade, this has always been about something else. Revenge." Eli said the word, tasting like ash. "He's not building an empire. He's building a tomb. And he wants to bury everyone responsible in it." He looked at her, the full weight of his past exposed. "Your father's investigation wasn't just a threat to his business. It was a threat to unearthing the one secret he has spent his life protecting. And I was the last living witness. The last person who knew what really happened that day. He didn't send Hawkins after the journal. He sent him after me." Sarah looked from Eli's tormented face to the leather-bound journal that lay beside her. Her father's quest for justice had inadvertently stumbled into a decades-old story of personal tragedy and vengeance. And Elijah Morgan, the hero from the photograph, was standing right at its heart. The revelation changed everything. The conflict was no longer a simple matter of good versus evil, of justice against corruption. It was a tangled knot of grief-guilt and a thirst for vengeance that had festered for over a decade. Sarah, looking at Eli, no longer saw just a protector. She saw a man as haunted and victimized by Sherman Wade as she was. Her anger softened into a profound and sorrowful empathy. They had to get to Silver Creek. They needed to use the telegraph to warn the governor, to frame the evidence from the journal not just as a story of corporate greed, but as the bloody culmination of a personal vendetta. Chief Night Sky, the Ute leader, agreed to help. He saw in Wade a man whose personal grief had made him a threat to all people, white and Ute alike. He provided them with an escort of his best warriors, led by Grey Wolf. Their journey to Silver Creek was a tense, silent affair. Eli was lost in his past, reliving the horrors of the Coulter Homestead massacre. Sarah was absorbed in the journal, seeing her father's meticulous notes in a new tragic light. They arrived at the outskirts of Silver Creek to find the town transformed. It was an armed camp. Men loyal to Wade, wearing the railroad's insignia, patrolled the streets, their authority bolstered by a corrupt local sheriff. Hawkins was in command, and he had turned the town into a cage. Their Ute allies scouted a way in through an abandoned mining tunnel that, according to local legend, emerged in the basement of the town church. They made their way through the dark, damp passage and found their way to the town's telegraph operator, Martha Reynolds, an elderly widow and a secret confidant of Senator Carpenter. Martha was a woman of iron will, her grief for her friend the senator having forged itself into a cold resolve. "We have to get a message out," she said, her hands moving deftly over her telegraph key. "But Hawkins has men watching my office day and night." The situation seemed impossible. They were trapped in a town controlled by the enemy. But as they conferred in hushed tones in the back room of Martha's office, the sky outside began to darken unnaturally. The wind began to howl, and a fine, gritty dust began to seep through the window frames. A sandstorm, one of the vicious, blinding gales that could spring up without warning, was descending on Silver Creek. The storm was their chance. It provided chaos and cover. But it also cut them off completely. No one was getting in or out. As the storm hit its full roaring fury, turning day into a surreal orange twilight, Hawkins and his men made their move. They forced their way into the strongest building in town to wait out the storm, the bank. The same bank where Eli, Sarah, and Martha had decided to take refuge, believing its thick stone walls offered the best protection. The standoff began. Trapped inside the bank with the sandstorm howling like a legion of ghosts outside, Eli, Sarah, and a few allies, including the brave Martha Reynolds, found themselves in a claustrophobic siege. Dust seeped through every crack, coating everything in a fine red powder. The world was reduced to the confines of the bank lobby and the muffled sounds of their enemies moving around outside. Then a new figure appeared through the swirling dust, walking calmly down the middle of the street as if the storm were a minor inconvenience. Sherman Wade. He had come to oversee the end of his long quest. He didn't try to storm the bank. He simply stood outside the main doors, his voice carrying over the wind. "Morgan, it's time we finish this. The debt you owe me for your life, and the debt I owe you for your silence." Eli moved to the reinforced window, peering out at the man who had been his commander, his savior, and his curse. "It's over, Wade," Eli shouted back. Over Wade's laugh was a bitter, broken sound. "It will never be over. Not until everyone who was there that day has paid. You were the last one, Morgan. The last piece of my past I had to erase." He held up a small hand-carved wooden bird, the toy Eli saw in his nightmares. "This was my daughter's," Wade called out, his voice thick with a grief that had curdled into madness. "They took her from me. You, your soldiers. You took her from me. And for that you will watch everything you care about turn to dust." Inside the bank, Sarah looked at Eli, her eyes filled not with accusation, but with a fierce protective loyalty. "He's wrong," she said. You are not that man anymore. Eli knew what he had to do. He had to face his past not just in his own mind, but in the open. He had to confess his role not just to Sarah, but to the world to reclaim his own story from Wade's twisted narrative of revenge. He turned to his small band of allies. Barricade the doors. I'm going to use my knowledge of military tactics to turn this place into a fortress. He may have the numbers, but we have the ground. He looked at Sarah. And we have the truth. The climax was a desperate, brutal affair fought in the claustrophobic, dust-choked confines of the bank. Eli directed their defense with grim precision, using the building's architecture to create choke points and fields of fire. The sandstorm raged outside an elemental chorus to their human drama. The final confrontation came down to a brutal, hand-to-hand fight between Eli and Hawkins, amidst shattered furniture and flying glass. In the end, as the sandstorm began to subside, it was Wade himself who breached the final barricade, his face a mask of cold fury. He and Eli faced each other. Two old soldiers, two ghosts of a shared past, their pistols leveled. But before a shot could be fired, Wade's eyes fell on the leather journal, which had fallen open on the floor during the fight. He saw his daughter's name written in the senator's hand. He saw the truth of his own tragedy, documented by another. And something inside him, the last vestige of the commander Eli had once known, broke. He lowered his gun, a man defeated not by bullets, but by the weight of his own history. When the sandstorm cleared, the authorities, delayed by the storm, finally arrived. They found a town in chaos and a bank filled with the wounded and the dead. Sherman Wade was taken into custody, a silent, broken man whose vast empire had crumbled into nothing more than a monument to his own grief. His decades-long quest for revenge was over. In the weeks that followed, the story unfolded, shocking the territory and the nation. The contents of Senator Carpenter's journal, combined with Sarah's and Eli's testimony, laid bare the full extent of Wade's corruption and the tragic personal history that had fueled it. Months later, after the trial had concluded and Wade had been sentenced to life in the territorial prison, Eli received a letter. It was from Wade. It contained no words, only a hand-drawn map. Eli and Sarah, their own journey having forged a bond deeper than either could have imagined, followed the map. It led them to a desolate, windswept patch of land, the former site of the Coulter homestead. There, under a lone, twisted pine, were two unmarked graves. In his pocket, Eli held the silver locket Hawkins had stolen, which had been recovered after the fight at the bank. It was Sarah's last piece of her mother, a symbol of her own loss. He looked at her, and she understood. She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. This act was not about forgiveness. It was about ending a cycle. It was about acknowledging a shared humanity, a shared capacity for grief that could either poison the world or, with grace, be laid to rest. Eli knelt and placed the locket on the smaller of the two graves, the one that belonged to a little girl named Emily. The silver glinted in the afternoon sun, a small offering of peace in a place that had known only violence. It was a symbol of Eli's atonement for his past and of Sarah's choice to build a future not to be defined by what was taken from her, but by what she could give. As they stood together, the wind whispered through the pines, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt quiet. The ghosts were finally at peace.